The sun was a hammer, and the Arizona Territory was its anvil. It beat down upon the cracked ochre earth with a fury that bleached the sky to a pale, hazy white near the horizon. The air didn't move. It hung thick and heavy, shimmering in waves that distorted the distant mesas, making them tremble like reflections in disturbed water. It was a heat that baked the breath in your lungs and tasted of dust and scorched iron. Nothing stirred save for the tireless buzz of unseen insects and a lone figure staggering through the immense, indifferent silence. Her name was Abigail McCrae, though she hardly felt like she owned a name anymore. It was just a sound, a relic from a life that had ended yesterday morning in a room that smelled of stale whiskey and cheaper cologne. Now, there was only the searing pain in her feet and the frantic, animalistic need to put one in front of the other. She had lost her shoes somewhere back in the scrub. She couldn't remember where. It felt like a lifetime ago. Each step was a fresh agony. The ground was a griddle, littered with sharp-edged shale that sliced at her soles and tiny, vicious thorns that embedded themselves in her flesh. She no longer flinched. The pain had become a constant, a dull, throbbing rhythm that matched the frantic beat of her heart. A thin trickle of blood oozed from a deeper gash on the inside of her right foot, weaving a dark, sticky trail through the grime. With every step, a puff of fine, red dust would rise and cling to the moisture, forming a crusty scab of earth and lifeblood. It was a testament to her desperate pilgrimage, a mark she was leaving on a land that cared nothing for her survival. Her dress, once a respectable calico her father had bought her for the town social, was now a tattered ruin. The sleeve was torn away at the shoulder, leaving her skin exposed to the relentless sun, which had already turned it an angry, painful red. The hem was shredded, caked with dirt and snagged with burrs. She clutched the torn fabric of her bodice together with one hand, a futile gesture of modesty in a world that had stripped her of everything. It was a memory, a ghost of a habit from a time when such things mattered. But it was her eyes that told the real story. They were wide and ringed with exhaustion, darting from side to side, scanning the empty horizon as if expecting horsemen to appear at any moment. Every gust of hot wind that rustled the dry greasewood bushes made her jump. The shadow of a circling hawk passing overhead sent a jolt of pure terror through her. They were coming. She knew they were. Men like Jedediah Thorne didn't just let things go. Thorne, the mayor's son, with his soft hands and cruel, wet smile. He and his cronies, the ones who ran the town of Red Hollow as their own personal kingdom. Her mind was a maelstrom of fractured images, sharp and painful as the stones under her feet. Her father, Daniel, his face slick with the fever that had taken him in less than a week. His last words, a hoarse whisper. "Take care of the store, Abby. It's all we got." The store, a modest mercantile, filled with the scent of coffee beans, leather, and smoked bacon. It had been their life, built from nothing by her father's sweat and good name, a good name that had been worth less than nothing the moment he was in the ground. Then came Mr. Sterling, the banker, a man whose spine seemed to be made of ledgers and his heart of cold, hard currency. He'd shown up with a stack of papers and a practiced, sorrowful expression. "Debts. My dear Miss McCrae, your father was overextended." It was a lie. Her father had been meticulous, proud. He paid his debts, but his signature was there, on papers he'd never seen, for loans he'd never taken. When she'd protested, Sterling's sympathy had vanished, replaced by a cold flintiness. "The Thorns hold the notes now," he'd said, washing his hands of it. "You'll have to settle with them." The settlement. The memory made her stomach clench so hard she doubled over, gasping for air that felt like fire. It wasn't about money. It was never about money. It was about power. It was about the way Jedediah Thorne looked at her, as if she were just another asset to be seized, another property to be claimed. He and his 2 hired guns had arrived at the mercantile yesterday. They hadn't knocked. They'd kicked the door in, their spurs ringing on the floorboards her father had laid with his own hands. "Time to pay up, little bird." Jedediah had sneered, his eyes roaming over her, making her skin crawl. She had tried to be strong. She had stood her ground, her father's old scattergun in her trembling hands. It had been a foolish, brave gesture. They had laughed. One of the men had slapped the gun from her grasp as easily as swatting a fly. The sound of it clattering to the floor was the sound of her last hope dying. They had dragged her into the back room, the storeroom, and bolted the door. The things they said, the things they did. It was a black, suffocating wave in her memory. They hadn't broken her bones, but they had shattered something deeper, something essential. They had taken her dignity and ground it into the dirt, all while telling her it was a fair price for her father's debts. They had called it a settlement. When they were done, they had invented a new crime, claiming she'd stolen from the very bank that had falsified the loans, a final, cruel twist of the knife to ensure she could never speak out, never be believed. She was no longer a victim. She was a thief, a fugitive. Her escape had been a blur of instinct. While they were laughing and drinking her father's whiskey in the front of the store, she had found a loose board in the storeroom floor, a place her father had hidden a small cache of coins. She hadn't taken the money. She had wriggled through the crawl space underneath, scraping her back and hands raw on the hard-packed earth, and emerged into the alley behind the mercantile. And then she had run. She had run without looking back, away from the sounds of their laughter, away from the shell of her life, out of the town of Red Hollow and into the merciless furnace of the open range. Thirst was a living thing inside her now. Her tongue was a dry, swollen lump in her mouth, and her throat felt as if it were lined with sandpaper. She had stumbled upon a shallow, muddy puddle hours ago, the leavings of a rainstorm from weeks past, and had drunk from it greedily, not caring about the wrigglers or the foul taste. It hadn't been enough. Her body screamed for water, for relief, for just one moment of shade. She shielded her eyes, her hand trembling from the effort. The shimmering heat distorted everything. Was that a flicker of movement on the horizon, or just another trick of the light? Another phantom conjured by her desperate mind. She squeezed her eyes shut, then opened them again, focusing, praying. It was still there, a dark, solid line against the trembling sky. Not a mesa. It was too regular, too constructed. A fence line, and beyond it, a shape, a low-slung cabin, a stooped-shouldered barn, and the skeletal form of a windmill, its blades turning with an agonizing slowness in a breeze she couldn't feel. A ranch. The sight sent a surge of adrenaline through her, a current of pure, unadulterated hope that was so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. It could be salvation, or it could be another kind of hell. It didn't matter. It was a destination. It was a reason to take the next step, and the one after that. She fixed her gaze on the distant windmill, making it her North Star. The distance was deceptive in this vast, open country. What looked like a short walk could be miles. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the sun, the pain, and the ranch. Her world shrank to the few feet of cracked earth in front of her. She talked to her feet, pleading with them, promising them rest. She talked to her father, apologizing for losing the store, for not being stronger. She talked to God, making bargains she knew she couldn't keep. Her legs were shaking uncontrollably now, her vision starting to swim with dark spots. The ranch grew larger, no longer a silhouette but a real place of wood and stone. She could see the shimmer of a water trough near the corral. Water. The thought was a prayer, a mantra. She could almost taste it, cool and clean, washing the dust and bitterness from her throat. She was closer now, perhaps only 100 yards from the fence line. It might as well have been 1,000 miles. Her body had given all it had. Every muscle screamed in protest. Her breath came in ragged, shallow sobs. The world began to tilt, the sky and the earth swapping places in a dizzying spiral. She fell, landing hard on her hands and knees. The sharp pain of the impact barely registered against the symphony of agony that was her body. She stayed there for a moment, head hanging, dust puffing up around her with each panted breath. She could smell the dry, almost sweet scent of horse manure from the corral. It was the most beautiful smell in the world. It smelled of life. With a groan that was torn from the deepest part of her soul, she pushed herself up again. She would not die here, not in the dirt, not with Jedediah Thorne's laughter as her last memory. She would make it to that fence. She stumbled forward, her gait a drunken, lurching parody of a walk. 10 yards, 5, her outstretched hand, trembling and caked with dried blood and dirt, finally touched the rough, sun-bleached wood of a fence post. The contact seemed to drain the last ounce of strength from her. Her fingers slid down the splintered wood, leaving a faint smear of red. Her knees buckled one final time. The world dissolved into a swirling vortex of light and shadow, and the last thing she saw before the darkness took her completely was the cool, deep shade beneath the porch of the cabin, a haven just out of reach. Her body hit the ground with a soft thud, a small, broken thing at the edge of a stranger's world, finally free from the sun. Henry Callahan didn't see the world in days or weeks, but in seasons and the slow, steady turning of the earth. His life was a litany of quiet, deliberate tasks, each one flowing into the next with the unhurried certainty of a deep river. He was 60 years old, and the lines on his face were a map of droughts, hard winters, and a war that had ended 3 decades ago but had never truly left him. The silence of this remote patch of Arizona, carved out of the wilderness by his own 2 hands, was the only peace he had ever known. It was a silence he had earned, and he guarded it fiercely. He was sitting on his porch, in the long shadow of the cabin's eaves, meticulously working a leather awl through a stirrup strap that had begun to fray. His hands, gnarled and thick as old oak roots, moved with a practiced economy. There was no wasted motion in Henry Callahan. The sun was beginning its long, slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and crimson. The heat, though still immense, had lost its midday viciousness. He was about to set the strap aside when a flicker of movement at the far end of his property snagged his attention. It was nothing at first, a dark shape against the shimmering horizon, distorted by the heat haze. A coyote, perhaps, or a stray steer from a neighbor's herd miles away. He watched, his eyes narrowed to slits, the awl held motionless in his hand. He was a man who noticed things. It was a skill that had kept him alive in places where not noticing was a fatal mistake. The shape was too small for a steer, and it moved with a strange, lurching gait that wasn't the fluid trot of a coyote. It was upright, human. He set the leatherwork down on the worn wooden bench beside him. His face remained a stony mask, betraying nothing. Curiosity was a luxury he rarely indulged in, and visitors were a plague he actively avoided. But this was different. There was a desperation in the figure's movement, a frantic energy that was quickly failing. He watched as it staggered, fell, and rose again, its focus fixed on his ranch like a dying man crawling toward a mirage. He stood up, his joints protesting with a quiet crackle. He didn't reach for the rifle that was always leaning just inside the cabin door. Not yet. He simply stood and watched as the figure, which he could now see was a woman, stumbled the last few yards and collapsed in a heap against his fence line. She didn't make a sound. She just folded, a puppet with its strings cut, and lay still in the red dust. For a long moment, Henry didn't move. The crickets began their evening chorus, and the windmill gave a mournful groan as it turned. Anyone else might have shouted, "Run!" or ridden for the nearest neighbor, a good half-day away. Henry did none of these things. He walked down the porch steps, his boots making soft, deliberate thuds in the dirt. He moved without hurry, his long strides eating up the distance to the fence. He stopped a few feet from her, looking down. The girl was a wreck. Her dress was shredded. Her skin was burned raw by the sun, and one of her bare feet was caked in a mixture of dirt and drying blood. She was breathing, shallowly, but she was unconscious. He scanned the horizon in all directions, a slow, methodical sweep. The vast, empty landscape offered no answers, no tracks of horses, no telltale dust cloud. She was alone. He didn't speak. Words were clumsy things, and there was nothing to say that the situation didn't already scream. He unlatched the simple gate, swung it open, and knelt beside her. He was careful not to touch the bloodied foot. With a grunt of effort that was more about stiffness than weakness, he slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. She was lighter than a sack of feed, a fragile collection of skin and bone. He lifted her easily. As he stood, her head lolled back against his shoulder, and a soft, pained sigh escaped her lips. He carried her back to the cabin. The scent of her was dust, sun, and the metallic tang of fear. He kicked the door open and carried her inside, letting the door swing shut behind them, plunging the main room into cool, welcome dimness. The cabin was one large room, meticulously organized. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A bed, neatly made with a wool blanket, occupied a corner. A simple table and 2 chairs sat in the center. Everything was scrubbed clean, from the floorboards to the cast-iron pots hanging by the hearth. It was the space of a man who had nothing but time and a deep-seated need for order. He laid her gently on his bed, pushing aside the rough blanket. She moaned softly, but didn't wake. He looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and moved with purpose. He filled a basin with water from the pump barrel, the splash and creak of the handle the only sounds in the room. He took a clean rag from a chest and a bottle of whiskey from a high shelf. He wasn't a drinking man. Not anymore, but he always kept a bottle. For medicinal purposes, he told himself. For snake bites. For wounds. He returned to the bedside and sat on the edge of the mattress. He dipped the rag in the water and began to gently wipe the grime from her face. Beneath the dirt, her skin was pale, save for the angry red of the sunburn. She was young, too young for this kind of trouble. He worked his way down to her feet, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man whose hands were so calloused. He paused at the gashed foot. It was a nasty cut, deep and filled with grit. It would need cleaning, a proper cleaning. He uncorked the whiskey bottle. The sharp, alcoholic scent filled the small space. He knew this would hurt. He braced himself, pouring a small, steady stream of the amber liquid directly into the wound. The girl's body arched off the bed with a strangled gasp. Her eyes flew open, wide and wild with pain and confusion. They were blue, the color of a summer sky just before a storm, and they were filled with a terror so profound it seemed to suck the air from the room. She stared at him, at his weathered face, at the whiskey bottle in his hand, and she began to tremble violently. He said nothing. He simply held her gaze, his own eyes as gray and hard as granite. He set the bottle down and reached for the rag to clean away the blood and whiskey. It was then that she spoke, her voice a raw, broken whisper. "Wait!" He stopped, his hand hovering over her foot. She pushed herself up on her elbows, her whole body shaking like a leaf in a high wind. The movement was a massive effort. Her eyes never left his face, searching for something, a sign, a threat, an explanation. "Wait!" she repeated, her voice cracking. I'll take it off." Before he could process the words, before he could react, she reached up with a trembling hand and fumbled with the torn fabric of her bodice. Her fingers were clumsy, shaking too much to manage the simple task. She was trying to pull the ruined dress away from her body, her movements frantic, desperate. Henry froze. He watched her, his mind struggling to comprehend the meaning behind her words, behind the desperate action. "I'll take it off." It was a statement of surrender, a plea, an offer made by someone who had learned that her body was the only currency she had left to bargain with. With a final, desperate tug, the tattered fabric gave way. The torn calico fell open, exposing her shoulder and the top of her chest. And Henry saw it, a dark, ugly blossom of a bruise, a deep purple ringed with a sickly yellow, just below her collarbone. As the cloth shifted, he saw another, and then another, a constellation of violence marring her pale skin. They were the marks of fingers that had gripped too hard, of a fist that had struck without mercy, a map of cruelty. He stared. The world outside the cabin, the setting sun, the sound of the wind, it all ceased to exist. His hand, the one holding the damp rag, began to shake. It was a fine tremor at first, a slight vibration, but it grew until his whole arm was trembling. It was not a shake born of fear, or age, or infirmity. It was rage, a cold, silent, and ancient rage that had been sleeping deep within him for 30 years, now shocked awake. He wasn't looking at the girl on his bed anymore. In the dim light of the cabin, her face blurred and was replaced by another, a face with the same sky-blue eyes, the same soft brown hair. His sister, Sarah. He was a young man then, just back from the war, hard and full of a soldier's certainty. He'd found her crying in the barn, her dress torn in the same way, the same ugly marks on her skin, put there by a group of uniformed men who believed their victory gave them the right to take whatever they wanted. He had stood there then, silent, paralyzed by a rage so immense it had stolen his voice. He had done nothing in that crucial moment, and she had been taken from their lives, her spirit broken long before she vanished for good. His silence had been his greatest sin. The memory, sharp and vivid as if it were yesterday, slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. The tremor in his hand stopped. It became rock steady. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle jumped along his cheekbone. The girl, Abigail, watched him, her breath hitched in her throat, expecting a blow, a word, anything. Henry looked from the bruises on her skin to the terror in her eyes. He saw the same question in her gaze that he had seen in his sister's all those years ago. What will you do? He didn't speak. He still had no words, but this time, his silence was not the silence of paralysis. It was the silence of a gathering storm. He reached out, not to her, but to the torn dress. With a slow, deliberate motion that was almost reverent, he gently pulled the shredded fabric back into place, covering the evidence of her violation. He reached for the wool blanket at the foot of the bed and carefully, without touching her skin again, draped it over her trembling body, tucking it around her shoulders. It was a simple gesture, but in the charged silence of the cabin, it was a vow. It was an answer. He stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the fading light. He walked to the cabin door and took down the rifle. He didn't check if it was loaded. He knew it was. He returned not to the bedside, but to the simple wooden chair at the table, and sat down. He placed the rifle across his lap and fixed his gaze on the closed door, prepared to wait. He was a man who didn't speak, but he had made a promise, and this time, he would not be silent when trouble came knocking. Night fell on the high desert with the finality of a closing door, locking out the light and trapping the world in a profound, star-dusted darkness. Inside the cabin, a single oil lamp pushed back the shadows, its steady flame a small, defiant beacon in the vastness. The light flickered across the rough-hewn timbers of the walls, glinted off the long barrel of the rifle resting across Henry Callahan's lap, and pooled softly on the bed where the girl, Abigail, lay. She was asleep, but it was not a peaceful slumber. Her breathing was shallow, punctuated by soft whimpers and the occasional, violent twitch of a limb as her mind replayed the horrors of the day. Henry sat in his chair, a sentinel carved from shadow and regret. He had not moved since covering her with the blanket. He watched her, and in the deep quiet of the night, the years began to peel away, leaving him vulnerable to the ghosts he had spent a lifetime trying to outrun. The lamplight softened the hard lines of Abigail's face, making her look even younger, more fragile, It was this fragility that undid him. He was suddenly 30 years younger, standing not in his own cabin in Arizona, but in the dusty yard of his family's farm back in Missouri. The war was over, but its carrion crows had come home to roost. Men who had learned to take what they wanted and had never unlearned the lesson. And there was Sarah, his sister. She wasn't a broken thing in his memory, not at first. He remembered her as she was before, her hair the color of corn silk, her laugh like the chiming of a bell in a clear winter sky. She had a streak of stubbornness a mile wide and a heart so tender she would cry over a field mouse caught in a trap. She was the one who had kept their family stitched together after their mother passed, the one who could coax a smile from their grim-faced father. He, Henry, had been the strong one, the soldier, the protector. It was a role he had worn like a second skin. It was a role in which he had failed utterly. The memory came as it always did, unbidden and sharp as broken glass. It was a day much like this one, hot and still. He'd been mending a fence post, the rhythmic thud of his hammer the only sound in the sleepy afternoon. Then came the riders, 4 of them, still wearing parts of their faded blue uniforms, their faces flush with cheap whiskey and an arrogant swagger that set his teeth on edge. They were just passing through, they'd said, looking for water for their horses. He remembered the way they had looked at Sarah when she came out of the house with a dipper from the well. It was a look he had seen on the battlefield, a predator's gaze that strips away personhood and sees only prey. He had felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He should have told them to move on right then. He should have unslung the rifle from his shoulder and made his meaning plain. But he hadn't. He had been a fool. He'd believed the war was over, that the rules of civilization, however frayed, still held. He had nodded, said they were welcome to the water, and gone back to his work, trying to ignore the prickling on the back of his neck. The sounds that followed would haunt him for the rest of his life. Not screams. Sarah had been too proud, or too terrified, to scream. It was the sound of a scuffle from inside the barn, a sharp cry that was cut short, and then their laughter. Coarse, triumphant, ugly laughter that defiled the peaceful air of the farm. He had dropped his hammer. He had started for the barn, his blood roaring in his ears, a killing rage building in his chest. It was a rage he knew well, the soldier's rage, the one that let you charge a cannon line without a second thought. But this was different. It was tangled with something else, the sickening, helpless horror of knowing it was his sister, his Sarah. The rage grew so vast, so all-consuming, that it became a physical thing, a black wave that crashed over him and left him paralyzed. His feet felt as though they were nailed to the ground. He could see the barn door, just 50 yards away, but he couldn't make his legs move. He could hear the muffled sounds, could hear their jeering voices, and he just stood there, drowning in a fury so profound it had choked the strength from his limbs. He was a soldier frozen on the battlefield of his own home. The silence that followed their departure was worse than the laughter. He had finally forced his legs to move, his boots feeling like lead weights. He found her huddled in an empty stall, her dress torn, her face a mask of vacant shock. She had the same bruises blooming on her skin that he had seen on Abigail, the same deadness in her eyes. He had knelt before her, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? "I'm sorry, I should have been faster, I should have killed them." Every word was ash in his mouth. All he could offer was a silence that mirrored her own shattered stillness. And in that shared, terrible silence, he had felt the chasm open between them, a rift that would never heal. He hadn't protected her, and he didn't know how to comfort her. Sarah had faded after that day. The laughter was gone, the light in her eyes extinguished. She moved through their house like a ghost, and 6 months later, she was gone, leaving only a note on her pillow that said, "I have to find a place where I can breathe." They never saw her again. His inaction had not just failed her in that one horrific moment. It had cost him his sister forever. A soft whimper from the bed pulled Henry back from the abyss of his memory. Abigail was stirring. her brow furrowed in a troubled dream. He looked at her, at the dried tear tracks on her dusty cheeks, and the ghost of his sister seemed to stand beside the bed, her sad eyes asking the same question they had asked for 30 years. "What will you do now?" This time, the answer was clear. The rage was still there, a cold, hard ember in his core, but it was no longer paralyzing, it was clarifying. The world had taken his sister from him because he had stood by and done nothing. It would not take this girl, not from his home, not while he still drew breath. Abigail's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, they were unfocused, clouded with sleep and pain. Then, they cleared, and awareness dawned. She took in the unfamiliar surroundings, the log walls, the dying embers in the fireplace, the sheer novelty of being indoors and under a blanket. Her gaze moved around the room until it landed on him. Fear, immediate and electric, shot through her. She flinched, pulling the wool blanket up to her chin like a shield. She saw a large, formidable man, his face carved with harsh lines, holding a rifle. Her body tensed, preparing for a threat, because threats were all she had known. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped. She watched him, barely breathing, her heart hammering against her ribs. She tried to read his face, but it was an unreadable landscape of stone and shadow. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched her with those gray, steady eyes. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. It was a silence she knew. It was the silence before the storm, the quiet before the cruelty began. In her experience, men were never silent for long. Sooner or later, they always stated their price. She had to know. The uncertainty was its own kind of torture. She had to know what he wanted, what he planned to do with her. Was he going to hurt her? Was he going to hand her back to Thorne and his men for a reward? Or was he simply going to cast her out, back into the wilderness where she would surely perish? The last option seemed the most likely. Why would a stranger want the burden of a runaway? A girl with nothing to her name but trouble. She moistened her lips, her tongue still feeling thick and dry. She had to force the words out, pushing them past the lump of fear in her throat. Her voice, when it came, was a small, fragile thing, barely more than a whisper in the quiet room. Are you going to make me leave?" The question hung in the air between them. It was more than a question about shelter for the night. It was a question about her own worth. It was the question of a soul that had been told, in the most brutal of ways, that it was disposable. She braced herself for the answer she expected, the nod, the curt dismissal, the inevitable casting out. Henry looked at her. He saw the terror in her eyes, the way she was trying to make herself invisible under the blanket. He saw every person who had ever been kicked, beaten, and told they were worthless. He saw his sister. He leaned forward slightly, though he did not stand. He wanted her to hear him, to understand the weight of his words. His own voice was rough, a low baritone gravelly from disuse. When he spoke, the sound seemed to come from the very bedrock of the earth. No. It was just one word, but it landed with the force of a verdict. He paused, letting it sink in, letting it counter the fear in her eyes. Then he finished, his gaze unwavering. "You're safe here." There was no warmth in his tone, no gentle reassurance. It was a statement of fact, as unadorned and solid as the stone of the fireplace behind him. It was a promise forged in the fires of a 30-year-old failure. It was the foundation of a new wall he was building around this cabin, around her. Abigail stared at him, her mind struggling to accept the words. Safe. The concept was so alien she could barely grasp its meaning. She searched his face, looking for the catch, the lie, the hidden clause. She found nothing but a grim, unyielding certainty. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the frantic, panicked fluttering in her chest began to subside. It wasn't replaced by relief. Not yet. It was replaced by a profound and weary confusion. She didn't understand this man. She didn't understand why he would offer sanctuary to a stranger. But as she looked into his hard, steady eyes, a tiny, improbable seed of trust began to take root in the barren soil of her heart. She didn't have to understand. For now, it was enough that he had answered. The sun rose the next morning not with a gentle dawn, but as a sharp, clinical blade of light that sliced across the desert floor. It found Henry Callahan already awake, as he had been for most of the night. He had moved from the chair to his porch steps before the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky, the rifle never more than an arm's length away. Sleep had been a luxury he could not afford. The promise he'd made to the girl, and to the ghost of his sister, was a heavier burden than exhaustion. He moved through his morning chores with the same methodical rhythm he had practiced for 30 years. Yet everything felt different. The air was charged, the familiar silence of his homestead no longer peaceful, but watchful. When he fed and watered his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Soldier, he found himself scanning the long, empty horizon between each scoop of oats. The simple act of pumping water into the trough was punctuated by pauses, his head cocked, listening for a sound that did not belong. The threat was no longer a memory. It was a tangible presence, waiting just over the next rise. Inside the cabin, Abigail awoke slowly to the smell of wood smoke and brewing coffee. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. The crushing fear of the previous day rushed back in, a cold tide in her chest. She sat up with a gasp, her muscles screaming in protest. The blanket fell away, and the sight of the dark bruises on her arms was a stark reminder. Then she saw him. He was standing by the fireplace, his back to her, tending to a small pot over the fire. He was not looking at her, and the rifle was leaning against the wall, but she knew it was close. She remained perfectly still, a frightened mouse watching a hawk, unsure if she had been noticed. He seemed to be a different man in the morning light. Not a terrifying shadow, but a solid, weathered figure, his movements economical and sure. He seemed as much a part of this landscape as the mesas and the scrub oak. Without turning around, he spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "There's coffee and biscuits in the warmer." His knowing she was awake without looking startled her. She slid cautiously off the bed, her bare feet finding the floorboards cool and smooth. Her gashed foot throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. But it was clean, and the whiskey had stopped any festering. She was weak from hunger and dehydration, her body a collection of aches and pains. But the sleep, however fitful, had restored a sliver of her strength. On a nearby chair lay a set of clothes. Not hers. It was a simple, homespun dress of faded blue cotton and a pair of worn but sturdy leather boots. They were old, clearly stored away for a long time, but they were clean. It was a gesture of such unexpected, practical kindness that it brought tears to her eyes. She quickly changed out of her ruined calico, the simple act of putting on whole, clean clothes, feeling like she was shedding a layer of the horror and humiliation. The dress was a little large, the boots a little stiff, but they were a suit of armor. She poured herself a tin cup of coffee, her hands shaking slightly. It was black, strong, and scalding hot. She took a biscuit from the small warming oven built into the side of the fireplace. It was hard and dense, made with lard and flour, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. They existed in a shared silence, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the sound of her eating. It wasn't an awkward silence, but a heavy one, filled with the unspoken reality of their situation. It was Henry who heard it first. He was staring into the fire, but his head tilted almost imperceptibly. His entire body went still, his posture shifting from that of a man at rest to one on high alert. Abigail, chewing her biscuit, hadn't heard a thing. She watched him, a fresh wave of fear washing over her. "What is it?" she whispered. He didn't answer immediately. He straightened up, walked to the cabin door, and opened it a crack, peering out into the blinding morning sun. The sound was clearer now. A low, rhythmic drumming that was not the wind. It was the sound of horses, moving at a steady, purposeful pace. More than one. "Get away from the window," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He turned from the door, his face grim, and picked up his rifle. He checked the action with a swift, practiced movement that sent a metallic shick-shack echoing through the small cabin. The sound was cold and final. Abigail scrambled back from the table, pressing herself into the darkest corner of the room, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She peered through a small gap in the log, chinking, her breath held tight in her chest. They appeared over the low rise to the east, 3 riders silhouetted against the bright morning sky. Even from a distance, their intent was clear. They were not lost travelers or friendly neighbors. They rode with an arrogant assurance, as if the land already belonged to them. As they drew closer, she recognized the man in the lead, Jedediah Thorne. He was dressed in a tailored coat and riding boots that were far too fine for the dusty territory, a preening peacock in a land of hawks. Flanking him were 2 other men, a stark contrast to Thorne's finery. They were hard-faced and weathered, with pistols strapped low on their hips. They rode with a lazy slouch that was more dangerous than any rigid posture. They were wolves, and Thorne was the man who held their leashes. Henry stepped out of the cabin and onto the porch. He didn't close the door behind him, leaving it open a few inches. He didn't walk out to meet them in the yard. He stood his ground on his own porch, a single, unmovable obstacle. He held the rifle not pointed, but cradled across his chest, the message clear. This was his home. He was not the one who would have to ask for permission. The 3 riders reined in their horses about 20 yards from the porch, the animals snorting and stamping in the dust. The sudden silence was deafening. Jedediah Thorne surveyed the scene with a smug, proprietary air, the small cabin, the old man, the quiet ranch. His lips curled into a sneer. "Well now, old-timer," he called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "Quite the little homestead you've got here, a bit remote for my tastes, but to each his own." Henry said nothing. His silence was a wall, and Thorne's words bounced off it, falling flat in the dust. Thorne's smile tightened. He wasn't accustomed to being ignored. "We're not here for social pleasantries," he said, his tone sharpening. "We're looking for something, or rather, someone. A thief. We have reason to believe you're harboring a fugitive from the law." Henry's gaze remained steady, his face impassive. "Is that a fact?" he stated. It wasn't a question. It was a flat, dismissive comment that invited no argument and offered no information. "It is a fact," Thorne snapped, his irritation growing. "A girl, Abigail McCrae, ran out of town yesterday after stealing a rather large sum of money from the Red Hollow Bank. We tracked her out this way." He gestured vaguely at the surrounding desert. "This is the only settlement for 20 miles. Now, are you going to be cooperative, or are we going to have to do this the hard way?" One of the hired guns, a wiry man with a perpetual squint and a scar that cut through his eyebrow, shifted in his saddle. "He means we're coming in, old man," the man rasped, his hand drifting down to rest on the butt of his pistol. Henry's eyes flickered from Thorne to the hired gun, a brief, cold glance that held more menace than a shouted threat. Then his gaze returned to Thorne. "You want to search my home," he said, his voice still low and even. "You got a warrant?" Thorne laughed, a short, ugly bark that held no humor. "A warrant? A piece of paper from some judge 100 miles away." He leaned forward in his saddle, his face contorted with arrogance. "I am Jedediah Thorne. My father is the mayor of Red Hollow, in this part of the territory. My word is the warrant." "Not on my land, it ain't," Henry replied, the words as hard and unyielding as the rock beneath their feet. "This property is deeded in my name, paid for, surveyed, and filed with the territorial government. The law says you don't set foot past that porch without a warrant signed by a federal marshal or a circuit judge. Your word means nothing here." The air grew thick with tension. Thorne's face flushed a deep, angry red. He had come here expecting to intimidate a feeble old recluse, to walk in and take what he wanted. He had not expected a lesson in territorial law from a man who looked like he'd been hewn from granite. "Now, you listen to me, you stubborn old goat!" Thorne spat, his voice rising. "That girl is a common thief, and I will not be stopped by some dusty farmer playing lawyer." The second hired gun, a larger, broader man who hadn't moved a muscle until now, slowly spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "He's got you there, Jed," the man said, his voice a low rumble. "Property laws is property laws. Be a whole lot of paperwork if things go sideways." Thorne shot him a look of pure venom, but the bigger man just shrugged, his eyes on Henry. He was a professional, and he was assessing a situation that had just become far more complicated than a simple collection job. He saw the way Henry stood, balanced on the balls of his feet. He saw the way he held the rifle, not as a prop, but as an extension of his arms. He saw the cold, clear certainty in the old man's eyes. This was not a farmer. This was something else. Infuriated by the lack of fear and the unexpected complication, Thorne made a decision. "Fine," he hissed. "You want to stand on ceremony, we'll play it your way. For now." He pulled sharply on his reins, turning his horse, but he couldn't leave without a final show of power, a final reassertion of his dominance. He stopped and looked back, his eyes burning with malice. "This isn't over. Callahan," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you're safe out here. You think your deed and your rifle make you a king. This is a lonely stretch of land. It's amazing the kind of trouble a man can find himself in out here all alone. Fires start so easily in the dry season. Wells can go foul. A man can have a fall. You protect that little thief, and you'll find out just how lonely it can get." He didn't wait for a reply. He spurred his horse, and the three of them galloped away, their hoofbeats a departing threat that echoed across the plains, leaving a cloud of dust and a suffocating silence in their wake. Henry did not move. He stood on the porch, rifle in hand, and watched until they were nothing more than a faint speck on the horizon. Only then did he allow the tension to seep from his shoulders. He turned and walked back into the cabin, the morning sunlight a harsh glare at his back. Abigail was still pressed into the corner, her face as white as bleached bone, her body trembling. The fragile shell of safety she had felt that morning had been shattered. The monster she had fled had a name, and it had found her. Henry didn't offer words of comfort. They would have been hollow, useless. Instead, he walked to the wall, took down a powder horn and a small leather pouch of lead balls, and set them on the table. He began the slow, methodical process of cleaning his rifle. The quiet, rhythmic scrape of the cleaning rod sliding down the barrel was the only sound. It was an answer to Thorne's threat. It was a promise. The siege had begun. The dust settled, but the silence Thorne and his men left behind was heavier and more menacing than the one that had preceded them. It was a silence filled with the echo of a threat, a promise of violence that now hung over the small ranch like a thunderhead that refused to break. The sun climbed higher, baking the air, but inside the cabin, a chill had taken root. Henry finished cleaning his rifle, his movements as steady and deliberate as a clock's mechanism. He worked the oiled rag through the barrel, checked the firing pin, and reassembled the weapon with an intimacy born of long and bloody acquaintance. He was not just cleaning a tool, he was communing with it, reaffirming a pact. When he was done, he did not return it to its pegs by the door. He leaned it against the table, its muzzle pointed toward the ceiling, an ever-present sentinel in the room. Abigail remained in the corner, the forgotten biscuit and half-empty coffee cup on the floor beside her. She had wrapped her arms around her knees, trying to make herself small, as if she could shrink away from the trouble she had brought to this man's door. Guilt was a bitter, rising bile in her throat. This man, this stranger, had shown her a sliver of kindness, and in return, she had led wolves to his doorstep. His quiet, ordered world was about to be torn apart because of her. She should leave. She should slip out the back and run again. Run until her heart gave out, and draw the trouble away from him. But where would she go? Thorne's threat had not been just for Henry. It was a net, cast wide. He would have men watching the trails, the water holes. To run now would be to run directly into their hands. The safety she had felt in this cabin was an illusion, a brief, fragile bubble that Thorne's words had popped. Now, the cabin felt like a trap, and she and Henry were caught in it together. Henry moved from the table to the fireplace. He tossed another piece of mesquite onto the embers, sending a fresh plume of fragrant smoke up the chimney. He refilled the coffee pot with water from the pump and set it back on the grate to heat. He did all this without looking at her, yet she felt his awareness of her in the corner, a steady, constant pressure. He was not ignoring her. He was giving her space, letting the initial shock of the confrontation subside. Finally, he poured 2 fresh cups of coffee. He walked over and placed one on the floor beside her. He didn't speak, didn't try to offer empty words of comfort. He just set the cup down and returned to his chair at the table. It was a simple, practical gesture, but it was an acknowledgement. I am still here, we are still here. Abigail looked at the steaming tin cup. The dark, bitter liquid smelled of the earth, of warmth, of life. She picked it up, her hands cupped around it, letting the heat seep into her chilled fingers. She took a sip. The coffee was strong enough to peel paint, but it was grounding. It was real. She looked at Henry. He sat at the table, staring at his own cup, his face a mask of stone. He had stood up to Jedediah Thorne. He had not flinched, had not backed down. He had quoted the law and met arrogance with an immovable certainty. He had done it for her, a worthless, trouble-making stray. Why? The question burned in her mind. She could not accept his protection, this enormous risk he was taking, without giving him the truth. He deserved to know exactly what kind of trouble he was harboring. He deserved to know who he was risking his life for. "My father's name was Daniel," she began, her voice quiet but clear in the still room. Henry's gaze shifted from his cup to her. He didn't speak, but his eyes told her to continue. He was listening. He wasn't a rancher. He ran the mercantile in Red Hollow. He was a good man, an honest man. Everyone said so. He knew everyone's name, knew how their children were. Always had a piece of penny candy for them. Her voice caught, and she paused, taking another sip of coffee to steady herself. The fever came through last spring. It was fast. He was strong as an ox one day and gone the next. It took him in a week. She stared down into her cup, seeing not the black coffee, but her father's face, pale and slick with sweat. Before he died, he told me to take care of the store. He said it was all we had. He was so proud of it. He built it himself, from the ground up. She looked up at Henry again, needing to see if he was still with her. He was. His expression hadn't changed, but his focus on her was absolute. After the funeral, Mr. Sterling from the bank came to see me. He was carrying a ledger and had this sad look on his face, the kind of look a coyote gets before it takes one of your chickens. He said my father had debts, big ones. He showed me papers, promissory notes, with my father's signature on them, but they weren't his. I know his hand. He had a way of looping his D. These were forgeries, clumsy ones, if you knew what to look for. I told him that. I told him my father paid his debts as he went, that he never would have borrowed so much. Sterling's sad face just melted away. He got cold. He said the debt was real and that the notes had been bought by Mayor Thorne. He said I'd have to settle it with his son, Jedediah. She took a shaky breath, the memory of that name bringing the metallic taste of fear back into her mouth. I knew what that meant. Everyone in Red Hollow knows what that means. The Thornes don't buy debt because they're bankers. They buy it to own people. They own half the ranches in the valley that way. Something bad happens, a drought, a sickness in the herd, and suddenly the Thorns are there with a helping hand that turns into a fist. Jedediah and his men came 2 days ago. They didn't come to talk about money. They walked in like they owned the place already. Jedediah. He smiled at me and said it was time for a settlement. The word came out like a poisoned thing. I had my father's old scattergun. I thought if I showed them I wasn't afraid, they'd leave. A single hot tear escaped and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She wiped it away angrily. They just laughed. One of them took the gun from me like he was taking a toy from a child. They dragged me into the back room. They said I had a choice. I could sign the deed to the mercantile over to them, or they could take their payment out of my hide. She faltered, the words catching in her throat. The cabin was silent save for the crackling of the fire. She couldn't bring herself to describe the violation, the brutal hands, the mocking laughter. She didn't have to. The bruises on her skin were a testament that spoke for her. She skipped ahead, her voice hardening. They hurt me, she said, the simple statement carrying more weight than 1,000 descriptive words. They beat me until I couldn't fight anymore. And when they were done, they took the deed, and I signed it. What else could I do? Henry's face remained impassive, his eyes fixed on her. But beneath the table, his hand, wrapped around his coffee cup, began to tighten. His knuckles went white. The thick, calloused skin stretched taut over the bone. The tin cup, sturdy as it was, began to creak under the pressure. That should have been the end of it, Abigail continued, her voice now a low, bitter monotone. They had what they wanted, but it wasn't enough for them. It wasn't enough to take my home, to do what they did. They had to destroy me, too. Jedediah said that a girl who would try to hold out on a debt couldn't be trusted. He said for all he knew, I'd been stealing from my own father for years. He said he was going to have the bank look into it. I knew it was a lie, a way to ruin my name so that no one would ever listen if I tried to tell what they'd done. So I ran. I crawled out through the floorboards and I just ran. They must have gone to the bank right after, because by the time they came looking for me, the story had changed. I wasn't a girl who had lost her store. I was a thief who had robbed the Red Hollow Bank and fled justice. That's what they were shouting in the street. That's the story they'll tell everyone. She finished, her story told. She was empty now, drained of words and tears. She had laid the truth at his feet, a heavy, ugly bundle of facts. Now he knew. He was not protecting an innocent victim. He was harboring an accused thief, a woman with the most powerful family in the county hunting her down. He had every right to tell her to go. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. She braced herself for it, for the inevitable turning away. Henry looked at her, at the defiant tilt of her chin, at the deep, soul-weary pain in her eyes. He didn't see a thief. He saw the same trapped look he'd seen on the faces of young soldiers cornered by a superior force. He saw the same hopeless despair he'd seen in his sister's eyes. He saw another life about to be consumed by the casual cruelty of powerful men. His silence, 30 years ago, had been a betrayal. He had stood by while the world broke his sister. He had spent the rest of his life in this self-imposed exile, atoning for a sin of inaction. The tin cup in his hand finally gave way. It crumpled with a sharp groan of protesting metal, sending a splash of hot coffee over his knuckles. He didn't seem to notice the pain. He simply opened his hand and let the ruined cup fall to the table with a dull clatter. The sound broke the spell. He pushed his chair back and stood up, his tall frame seeming to fill the entire cabin. He did not look at Abigail. He walked to the far wall, to a place beside the stone chimney. There, mounted on 2 thick wooden pegs, was another firearm. It was not a rifle. It was a 12-gauge shotgun, a coach gun with twin barrels sawed down to a legal but menacing length. It was a brutal, close-quarters weapon, designed for one purpose: to stop a fight before it could properly start. It was a gun that spoke a different language than the rifle. The rifle was for the plains, for distance. The shotgun was for the porch. With a quiet deliberation, he lifted the shotgun from its pegs. The worn walnut stock was smooth in his hands. He checked the action, then reached up to the mantelpiece, where a box of brass-hulled shells sat. He broke the shotgun open, slid 2 thick shells into the barrels, and snapped it shut with a final, definitive click-clack. He did not hang it back on the wall. He walked back to the table and laid the shotgun down gently beside the rifle. 2 guns, 1 for each of them. He still hadn't said a word, but as Abigail looked at the 2 weapons lying on the table, a silent declaration between them, she understood. He wasn't going to make her leave. He wasn't standing by. This time, he was standing with. The war had come to his doorstep, and Henry Callahan was preparing to fight. The hours that followed bled into one another, thick and slow as molasses. The initial adrenaline of the confrontation gave way to a draining, nerve-shredding state of vigilance. The sun, a hostile eye in a bleached white sky, beat down on the small cabin, turning the interior into a stuffy, airless oven. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like the whisper of an approaching rider. Henry became a creature of pure, pragmatic preparation. He did not sit and wait. He moved with a quiet, relentless energy that spoke of a man well acquainted with sieges. He started by leading his buckskin soldier from the corral into the small, sturdy barn that abutted the cabin. An animal in the open was a liability. He then spent a solid hour reinforcing the cabin's weaknesses. He hammered fresh wooden bars across the insides of the 2 small windows, leaving only narrow slits to see and shoot through. He checked the heavy wooden plank that barred the main door, ensuring its bracket was sunk deep into the log frame. He filled every bucket and basin with water from the well, a grim acknowledgement that this might be his last chance to do so freely. Abigail watched him, her fear slowly being replaced by a kind of awed respect. He was not a man given to panic. Every action was deliberate, calculated, and aimed at a single-purpose survival. She found herself wanting to help, to do something other than cower in a corner. She took a rag and, without a word, began to methodically wipe down the surfaces of the cabin, the table, the mantelpiece, the stocks of the guns. It was a small, domestic act, almost absurd under the circumstances, but it was a way of imposing a tiny amount of order on a world that had descended into chaos. It was a way of saying she was not just a piece of baggage to be protected. She was a resident of this fortress, however temporary. As the afternoon wore on, the sky began to change. The relentless, empty blue began to bruise in the west, a deep, angry purple gathering on the horizon. The air, which had been still and suffocating, began to stir. A low, mournful sigh whispered through the eaves of the cabin, and the blades of the windmill, which had been turning with a lazy reluctance, began to spin faster, their groans becoming more insistent. Henry stopped his work and stood on the porch, sniffing the air. "Storm's coming," he said, his first words in hours. "A big one." The change was rapid. The light began to fail, the world outside taking on a strange, yellowish-gray tint. The wind rose from a whisper to a howl, kicking up sheets of red dust that pelted the cabin like handfuls of thrown gravel. The temperature dropped, the oppressive heat replaced by a sudden, clammy chill. Then came the first clap of thunder, a distant, guttural rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. He herded Abigail inside and barred the door. "They won't come in this," he said, his voice a low growl, barely audible over the rising shriek of the wind. "Not unless they're fools, but they'll be waiting for it to pass." The cabin, which had felt like an oven, now felt like a ship tossed on a violent sea. The wind slammed against the log walls, searching for any crack or weakness. Rain began to fall, not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets that hammered against the roof and sluiced down the window panes, obscuring the outside world completely. Each flash of lightning lit the interior in a stark, momentary blue-white glare, followed by a crash of thunder so immediate and violent It felt as if the sky were splitting apart directly overhead. Henry lit the oil lamp, its small, steady flame a fragile anchor in the roaring chaos. He sat at the table, the shotgun and rifle before him, his face illuminated in the flickering light, looking like a grim prophet contemplating the end of the world. Abigail sat opposite him, the storm outside a perfect reflection of the turmoil in her soul. They were trapped. The thought circled in her mind like a vulture. Thorn and his men were out there, somewhere beyond the curtain of rain, coiled and waiting. They could wait for days. They could wait until the food ran out, until the water was gone, until exhaustion made them careless. Henry was a capable man, a fighter. She could see that now. But he was one man. She had not brought him salvation. She had brought him a death sentence. The guilt gnawed at her, sharp and relentless. She looked at his face, at the deep-set lines of weariness and resolve. He was doing this for her. He was prepared to die here, in this cabin, defending a stranger. And for what? So she could live another day, another week. Before Thorn inevitably caught up to her, it was a futile gesture, a noble but pointless sacrifice. Her mind, sharpened by fear and a growing, unfamiliar anger, began to race. The past 2 days had been a blur of running, of reacting. She had been the prey, her every action dictated by the hunters. But sitting here, in this roaring crucible of a storm, something shifted inside her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a layer of pure, incandescent rage. Rage at Thorn, at Sterling, at the men who had laughed while they destroyed her life. Rage at their smug certainty, at their belief that they were untouchable. They believed they held all the cards. They had the guns, the men, the power. They had turned her into a thief and a fugitive, ensuring no one would ever listen to her. Her word was meaningless. But what if she had more than her word? "They'll win," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the roar of the storm. Henry looked up, his gray eyes questioning. "They'll just wait," she continued, leaning forward, the words tumbling out of her now. "They'll sit out there until the storm passes, and then they'll just wait. They'll wait for us to run out of water. They'll wait for us to make a mistake. They have all the time in the world. We don't." "We have enough," Henry said, his voice a low rumble. It was meant to be reassuring, but it sounded like a man preparing for his own eulogy. "No," she insisted, shaking her head, her eyes burning with a new intensity. "No, we don't. We're doing exactly what they expect us to do. We're hiding. We're defending. We're playing their game, on their terms. As long as we stay here, we've already lost." Henry watched her, his expression unreadable. He saw the shift in her, the terror being forged into something harder, something more dangerous. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice cautious. This was it. The idea was mad. It was a wild, desperate gamble, born of a storm and a fury that matched its power. It was the only thing she had left. "What if we don't wait for them?" she said, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial pitch. "What if we go to them?" Henry stared at her as if she had lost her mind. "Go to them, into Red Hollow. That's not a plan. Girl, that's suicide. Thorn will have men watching every road, every trail. They'd see us coming 5 miles out." "Not on a night like this," she countered, gesturing to the rain-streaked windows. "Not in this storm. Who would be watching in a deluge, and we wouldn't use the road? We'd go on foot, across the flats. The storm would cover our tracks, muffle any sound. We could be in and out before they even knew we were gone. In and out of where Henry asked, his skepticism plain, "What's in town that's worth that kind of risk?" "Proof," Abigail said, the word hanging in the air with the weight of scripture. "The reason they're so desperate to catch me isn't because I stole anything. It's because I know they're the real thieves. It's because I can ruin them." She leaned further across the table, her hands flat on the rough wood, her gaze locked with his. "It's all in the bank. Everything. My father. He may have been a simple storekeeper, but he was smart. He taught me how to read a ledger. He used to say that numbers don't lie, but liars use numbers. The Thorns have been doing this for years. Henry, taking over ranches, businesses. They're like a disease. And the record of that disease, the proof of every crooked deal, every forged signature, every family they've ruined. It's all in the bank's main ledger. The bank is locked up tighter than a drum, Henry said flatly. And Sterling keeps those books in a 2-ton iron safe in his office. We'd need a block of dynamite to get into it. We wouldn't need to, she pressed, her excitement growing. The main ledger. Yes, that's in the safe. But the daily blotter, the transfer logs, Sterling is lazy. He leaves them out on his desk so he can work on them in the morning. The records of my father's loans. The deed transfer for my store. It would all be there, in his office, if we could get those pages. My word would suddenly mean something. It wouldn't just be me against the mayor's son anymore. It would be their own records, in their own ink, condemning them. We could take it to the federal marshal in Prescott. With proof like that, we could pull the whole rotten structure down on their heads. She sat back, her chest heaving. She had laid out her desperate, impossible plan. It was a long shot, a fool's errand, but it was better than sitting here, waiting to die. It was a chance, however slim, to fight back, to reclaim not just her life, but her name. Henry was silent for a long time. He stared at the shotgun on the table, his thick fingers tracing the line of the twin barrels. He was a man of defense, of fortification. His entire life for the past 30 years had been about building walls, about keeping the world out. She was asking him to do the opposite, to walk back into the world, into the very heart of the danger, on a mission that would likely get them both killed. He thought of Thorne's smug, arrogant face. He thought of his threat, the casual promise to destroy this small pocket of peace he had built. He thought of the bruises on Abigail's skin, and the memory of identical marks on his sister. He had failed Sarah by waiting, by being silent. Perhaps Abigail was right. Perhaps the only way to win was to stop waiting for the fight to come to you, and to take it to the enemy. He finally looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers across the flickering lamplight. A slow, grim look of calculation was dawning on his face. The plan was still madness, but it had the brutal, simple logic of a flanking maneuver. They would never expect it. He gave a single, slow nod, and then a flicker of something that was not quite a smile, but a shadow of one, touched the corner of his mouth. It was a look of pure, cynical irony. "The alley behind the bank," he said, his voice a low growl. "There's a window to Sterling's office. The glass has been broken for more than a year. It's just boarded up with a loose plank. Sterling is too cheap to pay a glazier to fix it properly." He paused, his gaze hardening. He probably figures no one would be fool enough to try and crawl through it. Abigail stared at him. The banker's greed, his miserly refusal to fix a broken window, was the very weakness they needed. The arrogance of these men, their belief in their own untouchability, was going to be their downfall. It was a perfect, terrible piece of irony. And for the first time since she had staggered out of Red Hollow, a genuine smile spread across Abigail McCrae's face. It was not a smile of happiness or joy. It was a sharp, fierce, dangerous smile. It was the smile of a woman who had just been handed a weapon, and who was finally ready to use it. The storm was a wild, living beast, and they were two fleas on its back, insignificant but determined. To leave the relative safety of the cabin was an act of profound, desperate madness. The moment Henry unbarred the door, the wind tore it from his grasp, slamming it back against the interior wall with a cannon-shot crack. Rain, cold and as sharp as buckshot, blasted into the room, instantly dousing the lamp and plunging them into a chaos of roaring wind and absolute darkness. Henry shouted something that was ripped away by the gale, but Abigail felt his hand clamp onto her arm, a grip of iron that was both a comfort and a command. He pulled her out into the maelstrom, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't see, couldn't think. It was a sensory assault. The wind howled in her ears, trying to tear the very air from her lungs, and the rain plastered her clothes to her skin in an instant, the cold seeping straight through to her bones. They moved not as two people, but as a single, four-legged creature, hunched low against the wind. Henry went first, his broad back taking the brunt of the storm's fury, his hand never leaving her arm. He carried the shotgun, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, while she had a small, empty grain sack tucked into her belt. The ground beneath their feet had turned into a slick, treacherous morass of red mud that sucked at their boots with every step. Lightning ripped the sky open every few moments, illuminating a world of frantic, lashing motion, a landscape gone insane. In those brief, stark flashes, she could see Henry's face, set and grim as a death mask. His eyes narrowed, fixed on some unseen point in the swirling darkness ahead. The journey was an eternity. Miles became an abstract concept, meaningless against the reality of each agonizing step. They fell, they rose, they pushed forward, driven by a shared, unspoken resolve. The storm was their enemy, but it was also their cloak. Under its roaring cover, they were ghosts, invisible and unheard. Red Hollow, when they finally reached it, was a town hunkered in submission. Not a single light shone from any window. The main street was a river of mud, the wooden sidewalks slick and treacherous. The wind howled down the narrow alleyways, rattling shutters and making the saloon sign swing on its chains with a high, mournful screech. It was a dead place, a town under siege by the heavens. Henry led them not down the main street, but through a series of backlots and shadowed alleyways, moving with a familiarity that surprised Abigail. He paused at each corner, a dark shape blending into the deeper shadows, listening to the storm, sensing for anything that felt out of place. Finally, they stopped behind a two-story clapboard building, its unpainted walls streaked and dark with rain, the Red Hollow Bank. The alley was a narrow, muddy canyon between the bank and the blacksmith shop next door. The wind was funneled through it, creating a vicious, howling vortex. Henry pointed up, to a single dark square high on the wall. The window. There was no finesse to their entry. Henry found a discarded barrel, slick with rainwater, and rolled it against the wall. It was still too low. He looked around, his eyes scanning the debris-strewn alley. He found a heavy, waterlogged shipping crate and, with a grunt of pure, brute effort, hoisted it on top of the barrel. The makeshift platform was wobbly, unsteady. "I'll hold it," he growled, his voice barely audible. "You go." Abigail didn't hesitate. She scrambled onto the barrel, her boots slipping in the mud, then onto the crate. Henry's hands were like stone buttresses against the base, holding the precarious structure steady. She could now reach the window. The plank was just as he'd described, held in place by two nails. She worked her cold, numbed fingers into the crack, pulling. It wouldn't budge. The wood was swollen and tight from the rain. She pulled harder, her muscles straining, a sob of frustration catching in her throat. Suddenly, the tip of a long, wicked-looking knife appeared in the crack beside her fingers. Henry, holding the platform steady with one hand in his shoulder, had drawn a skinning knife and was using it to pry at the board. There was a low groan of stressed wood, a sharp crack, and the plank came loose in her hands. She dropped it into the alley, the sound swallowed by the storm. The opening was a black, jagged maw. She took a deep, steadying breath, smelling the musty air from within, and wriggled through the opening, scraping her side on a shard of broken glass. She dropped lightly onto the floor inside, her boots making a soft thud on the wooden boards. She was in. The darkness inside the office was absolute, a thick, velvety blackness that felt heavier than the storm outside. The air was cold and smelled of stale cigar smoke, leather-bound books, and something else, the dry, metallic scent of money. She fumbled in her pocket for the small tin of lucifer matches and the stub of a candle she'd brought. Her hands were shaking so badly it took her 3 tries to strike a match. The small flame sputtered to life, a tiny, courageous star in the oppressive dark. She lit the candle, cupping her hand around it, and the shadows leaped back, revealing the room. It was Sterling's office. A large mahogany desk dominated the space, its surface cluttered with stacks of paper, an inkwell, and a half-empty glass. Behind it stood a monstrous iron safe, a silent, imposing beast guarding the town's secrets. Bookshelves lined one wall, and a threadbare carpet covered the floor. It was exactly as she remembered. A dark shape appeared in the window. Henry passed the oilcloth-wrapped shotgun through to her, then, with surprising agility for a man his size, hauled himself up and through the opening. Dropping to the floor with a low grunt, he took the shotgun from her and moved immediately to the office door, pressing his ear against it, listening. He gave a slight shake of his head. The bank was empty. "Find it," he whispered, his voice a ghost in the quiet room. "Quickly." Abigail didn't need to be told. She placed the candle on the desk, its small, flickering light casting dancing shadows on the walls. She began to search, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The storm still raged outside, but in here, every tiny sound was magnified: the rustle of paper, the soft scrape of her boots on the floor, the ragged sound of her own breathing. She moved with a desperate, focused energy. Her father had taught her Sterling's system. The man was a creature of lazy habits. Correspondence here, loan applications there, deed transfers in this drawer. She pulled open the heavy oak drawers of the desk. They were filled with the mundane minutiae of other people's lives, their hopes and their failures, all reduced to numbers on a page. She scanned the documents, her eyes darting from name to name. She saw the names of her neighbors, of people she had known her entire life. Then she found it. Tucked beneath a stack of blank deeds was not a large, bound ledger, but a smaller, cheaper book, a daily blotter. Its cover was plain cardboard. She opened it, and there it was. Her breath caught in her throat. It was all there, recorded in Sterling's neat, spidery script. She saw the entry for her father, Daniel McCrae, a loan for an astronomical sum, dated 2 weeks before he died, secured by the mercantile. It was a complete fabrication. Then, another entry, dated the day after the settlement, showing the loan satisfied by the transfer of the property deed to a holding company owned by Mayor Thorne. She began to turn the pages, her initial, narrow focus on her own family's ruin expanding into something far larger, far more horrific. It was a catalog of systematic plunder. Page after page held the same story, told with different names. The Jensen Ranch, lost after a single bad winter. The debt bought by Thorne for pennies on the dollar. The Miller blacksmith shop, seized when Miller's son fell ill and he couldn't pay for the medicine. The widow O'Connell's small boarding house, signed away after a mysterious fire. It was a list of everyone who had lost everything. Their names, their properties, their lives, all neatly recorded. A testament to the slow, methodical strangulation of an entire community. This book wasn't just evidence. It was the Thorne soul, laid bare and black on the page. "Henry," she breathed, her voice trembling. "I have it. It's all here." He moved from the door to her side, his shadow falling over the desk. He looked down at the open book, at the columns of names and numbers. His face was grim, but a muscle tightened in his jaw. This was the proof. This was the weapon. "Take the pages," he said, his voice urgent. "All of them that matter. Don't take the book." She understood immediately. A missing book would be noticed. A few missing pages might be overlooked for a day or two, dismissed as misfiling. It would buy them time, with trembling fingers. She carefully tore out the relevant pages, a dozen in all. The sound of the ripping paper was like a gunshot in the silent room. She folded them carefully and stuffed them into the grain sack she'd brought. It was done. They had what they came for. "Let's go," Henry growled, already moving back toward the window. As Abigail blew out the candle, plunging the room back into darkness, The storm outside seemed to pause, drawing a deep, shuddering breath. In that sudden momentary lull in the wind's howl, they heard it. A sound from the front of the bank, the unmistakable heavy tread of boots on the wooden sidewalk outside the main entrance. Henry froze, his hand on the window frame. He pulled Abigail back from the window, his arm a band of steel across her chest, pressing them both flat against the wall behind a tall, metal filing cabinet. Her heart, which had been pounding, now seemed to stop altogether. Cold, absolute terror seized her. They were no longer alone. Then came another sound, the rattle of a key in a lock, a heavy metallic thunk as the bolt on the bank's front door was thrown. A sliver of light appeared under the office door, followed by the slow, cautious creak of the main door opening. The footsteps were inside now, slow and measured, echoing in the cavernous main room of the bank. There was more than one person. Two, at least. Abigail held her breath, pressing her face against the cold, rough wood of the cabin wall. She could hear the blood roaring in her ears. This was it. They were trapped. A beam of light suddenly sliced through the darkness of the office. It wasn't a candle. It was the bright, focused beam of a bullseye lantern, the kind the town watch carried. It swept across the room, illuminating a swirling universe of dust motes. The beam danced across the desk, lingered on the chair she'd just been sitting in, and then swept up the wall, passing inches from where they were hiding. Abigail squeezed her eyes shut, convinced the light could somehow feel her presence, that the sheer force of her terror would give them away. The beam moved on, probing the corners of the room. It stopped, then came back, fixing on the open window, a black, jagged rectangle against the storm-tossed night. A voice cut through the darkness, rough and suspicious. It was the voice of the town's deputy, a man named Cobb, a known crony of the Thorns. "I saw a light in here," the voice rasped, seeming to come from just on the other side of the filing cabinet. "Swear to God, Marcus, I saw it flicker." The world behind the filing cabinet was a universe of sound and shadow. The rasp of Deputy Cobb's voice, the steady hiss of the rain outside, the frantic, terrified thumping of Abigail's own heart against her ribs. It was a symphony of impending doom. She was pressed so tightly against the cold metal that she could feel the vibrations of Henry's breathing beside her. He was utterly still, a statue of coiled tension. He held the shotgun in a low-ready position, its twin muzzles pointing toward the sliver of light under the office door. "Ain't no light. Cobb," a second voice grumbled from the main room. "Marcus," the other deputy. His voice was thick with boredom and a desire to be anywhere else. It was the lightning. "This storm's playing tricks on your eyes. Let's just check the door and get back to the saloon." "No!" Cobb's voice was insistent. "Closer now. It was a candle. I tell you, right in here." The beam of the bullseye lantern sliced back into the office. More purposeful this time. It didn't sweep. It probed. It lingered on the muddy boot prints near the window, a damning trail leading directly to their hiding place. The beam stopped, fixed on the filing cabinet. Abigail's breath hitched. This was it, the end. But Henry didn't wait for discovery. He didn't wait for Cobb to take another step. In the 30 years since he had frozen in his farmyard, a hard lesson had been calcifying in his soul. The only way to master a moment of terror is to move first. He exploded from behind the cabinet. It was not the clumsy lurch of a frightened man, but the swift, economical movement of a seasoned predator. He took one long stride into the center of the room, the shotgun coming to his shoulder in a single, fluid motion. The two deputies in the doorway were caught completely by surprise. Their faces, illuminated by the lantern Marcus held, were a comical mixture of shock and confusion. For a split second, time seemed to stretch and hang in the air. A silent tableau, the old man with the shotgun, and the two lawmen frozen in the doorway. Then Henry pulled the trigger. The sound was not a bang. It was a physical concussion. A deafening, chest-thumping roar that seemed to suck all the air from the small office. The enclosed space amplified the blast tenfold. A titanic clap of thunder that dwarfed the storm outside. A payload of heavy buckshot tore through the air, not aimed at either man, but at the lantern Marcus held aloft. The lantern exploded in a shower of shattered glass and burning oil. The room was plunged back into absolute, ringing darkness. The deputy's startled shouts swallowed by the shotgun's deafening echo. The burning wick and a spray of flaming kerosene arced through the air, landing on a pile of papers and deed filings that Sterling had left on a chair. The effect was instantaneous. The dry paper, saturated with oil, erupted in a whoosh of bright orange flame. "What the hell?" Cobb screamed, fumbling blindly for his pistol. Henry didn't give him the chance. He worked the action on the shotgun, ejecting the spent shell and chambering the second round. The metallic shuck-shuck was a terrifyingly intimate sound in the dark. He fired again, this time aiming high, sending the second blast of shot ripping through the plaster of the wall above the doorway, raining dust and debris down on the two men. The second shot was a clear and brutal message I am not trying to miss. Panic erupted. Marcus, his hand possibly peppered with glass from the lantern, cursed and scrambled back into the main room. A pistol shot rang out, wild and unaimed, the bullet splintering the mahogany desk before winding off into the darkness. "He's in the office," Cobb yelled. "Get him!" The fire was no longer a flicker. It was a hungry, growing beast. It leaped from the chair to the threadbare carpet, then to the heavy draperies on the window, devouring the dry material with a greedy, crackling roar. The office was filled with a frantic, dancing light and the thick, acrid smell of smoke. The fire was their new enemy, more immediate and indiscriminate than the men in the next room. The window. Now Henry's voice was a low command that cut through the chaos. He grabbed Abigail's arm, his grip like a vice, and hauled her toward the back wall. Abigail clutched the grain sack of papers to her chest. The evidence, it was the only thing that mattered. The heat was becoming intense, the smoke a choking, searing cloud that made her eyes stream. She could see Henry's silhouette against the growing inferno, a dark, avenging angel in a room of fire and shadow. Another pistol shot rang out, closer this time, as Cobb, emboldened by the light of the fire, poked his head around the doorframe. Henry, without aiming, swung the heavy shotgun like a club, smashing the stock into the door jamb just as Cobb appeared. The deputy yelped and jerked back, the move saving his life but costing him his nerve. There was no time for the platform outside. "Go!" Henry yelled, shoving Abigail toward the opening. She scrambled through, cutting her hands on the remaining shards of glass, and dropped into the muddy, rain-swept alley below. The cold, clean, storm-lashed air was a shocking relief after the smoke-filled office. She looked up just as Henry, a formidable dark shape against a backdrop of raging fire, swung his legs out and dropped beside her. The front of the bank was a cacophony of shouts and breaking glass now as the deputies, realizing they were facing a fire and not just a gunman, tried to get out. They didn't look back. They plunged back into the storm, into the howling labyrinth of Red Hollow's back alleys. The fire behind them was a growing, monstrous beacon, painting the underside of the storm clouds a sickening orange. The town was waking up. Shouts could be heard over the wind, and the frantic, clanging peal of the fire bell began to toll, a mournful, panicked cry in the heart of the tempest. They ran, fueled by adrenaline and terror, their boots splashing through the river of mud that was the main street. They were just two more shadows in a night of chaotic, shifting darkness. The storm that had been their cover for the infiltration was now their cover for the escape. By the time the first bucket brigade began to form, a futile effort against the oil-fueled blaze, Henry and Abigail were gone, swallowed once more by the vast, indifferent wilderness. The journey back was a waking nightmare, a grim, punishing slog through mud and driving rain. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the chattering cold of soaked-through clothes. Henry took the lead, his big frame a windbreak, his hand often reaching back to steady her on the treacherous ground. They didn't speak. There were no words for what they had done, for what they had survived. The only thing that mattered was the precious, crinkling weight of the paper in the sack Abigail clutched to her chest, protecting it from the rain with her own body. They stumbled back into the cabin just as the first hint of a watery, gray dawn began to dilute the eastern sky. They were covered in mud, soot, and bleeding from a dozen minor cuts. Henry barred the door, and the relative quiet of the cabin, with the storm's fury now abating to a steady drumming on the roof, felt like a sanctuary. Abigail collapsed into a chair, her body trembling uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion. She carefully pulled the damp pages from the sack. They were singed at the edges, smeared with mud and water, but they were legible. The truth, hard-won and battle-scarred. Henry stood by the newly barred window, shotgun in hand, watching the world outside slowly take shape. The fight wasn't over. Thorne would be enraged, a wounded animal. He would send his men. The siege was not lifted. It had merely entered a new, more dangerous phase. The sun rose on a world washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of impossible clarity and the fresh, earthy smell of rain-soaked sage. In the distance, a thin, black pillar of smoke rose lazily into the morning air. It was a stark, ugly scar on the pristine landscape, a monument to the night's violence. It was mid-morning when the riders appeared. Not 3, but a full dozen. They were not the slouching, predatory forms of Thorne's hired guns. They rode in a tight, disciplined column, their blue uniforms crisp, their movements precise. At their head, a man with captain's bars on his shoulders sat astride a powerful gray horse, his back ramrod straight, his eyes scanning the landscape with an air of absolute, unquestionable authority. U.S. cavalry. They reined in before the cabin. Henry stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held loosely in one hand. Abigail followed, standing just behind him, the singed papers clutched in her hand. The captain dismounted, his eyes taking in the scene, the weathered man, the frightened girl, the fortified cabin. "We were on patrol out of Fort McDowell," he said, his voice clear and resonant. "Got a telegraph from the station master in Prescott. Said a wire came through from Red Hollow late last night from a man named Peterson. Said Mayor Thorne's son had deputized a pair of hired guns and ridden out to settle a matter with an old rancher named Callahan." Sounded irregular. Then we saw the smoke. Just then, another group of riders appeared, coming from the direction of the town. It was Mayor Thorne, his son Jedediah, the banker Sterling, and what was left of their posse. Their faces were a mixture of fury and sleeplessness. When Jedediah saw the cavalry, he pulled up short, his arrogant sneer faltering for the first time. "Captain," Mayor Thorne called out, trying to project an air of authority he no longer possessed. "Thank heavens you're here. This man," he pointed a shaking finger at Henry, "is harboring a bank robber and an arsonist. She and this old lunatic burned down our bank last night." The captain's gaze shifted from the mayor to Henry, then to Abigail. His eyes were cold, impartial, missing nothing. "Is this true?" Henry did not answer. He simply looked at Abigail. This was her fight, her truth. Abigail stepped forward. The girl who had collapsed at the fence line 2 days ago was gone. In her place stood a woman, her face smudged with soot, her eyes clear and steady. She held up the scorched, water-stained pages. "No, Captain," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying with the unshakable force of truth. "They are the robbers, and this is their ledger." She walked forward and handed the papers to the captain. He took them, his gloved fingers gentle on the fragile evidence. As he read, his face, which had been impassive, hardened into a mask of cold fury. He looked up from the pages, his eyes locking onto Mayor Thorne, then Sterling, then Jedediah. It was the look of a man who had just passed judgment. "Sergeant," the captain said without taking his eyes off them. "Arrest these men, all of them, on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and extortion." For a moment, no one moved. The Thorns and their cronies stared in disbelief, their world crumbling around them. Then the blue-uniformed troopers dismounted, shackles in hand. The townspeople of Red Hollow, drawn by the commotion, had begun to gather at a distance, their faces a mixture of fear and dawning wonder. They watched in stunned silence as the most powerful men in their world, the men who had been the law, were stripped of their guns and bound like common criminals. They watched as the truth, born of bullets and fire, was finally brought into the light. For the first time, they were witnessing a power greater than fear. They were witnessing justice. The days that followed the arrests were stranger than the storm. Red Hollow, a town that had for so long been held in the grip of a quiet, suffocating fear, did not erupt in celebration. Instead, a profound and wary quiet settled over its dusty streets. It was the quiet of a man drawing his first free breath after a long illness, a breath that is tentative, uncertain, almost painful. The power of the Thorns had been a cancer, and its removal had left a void, a space of shock and disbelief. The cavalry did not linger. Their job was swift and military. They escorted the shackled Thorns, Sterling, and their hired guns on the long, ignominious ride to the federal courthouse in Prescott. But they left behind a different kind of authority, a U.S. Marshal named Elias Vance, a man who seemed to be made entirely of leather and quiet, unwavering purpose. He set up a temporary office in the sheriff's building from which Deputy Cobb had been unceremoniously evicted and began the slow, methodical work of untangling the web of deceit that had ensnared the town. Abigail did not return to Henry's ranch. The widow O'Connell, a woman whose boarding house had been one of the first properties returned to her by Marshal Vance's authority, insisted Abigail stay with her. She was given the best room, a sunlit space with clean sheets and a view of the main street. She was no longer a fugitive, but she didn't quite know what she was. In the eyes of the townspeople, she was something akin to a miracle. They would see her on the street and fall silent, their faces a mixture of awe, gratitude, and a kind of pity for what she had endured. They would nod, the men would tip their hats, but no one knew what to say. The story of the fire at the bank had become an instant legend, a tale of biblical retribution whispered in the saloon and over general store counters, growing more elaborate with each telling. Her testimony to Marshal Vance was the anchor in this sea of rumor. She sat in the small, sun-drenched office and told her story, not the one told in whispers, but the plain, unvarnished truth. She spoke of her father's death, of the forged notes, of the brutal settlement in the back room of her store. Her voice did not waver. The tears and terror had been burned out of her in the heat of the bank fire. All that remained was a core of cold, hard fact. Marshal Vance listened without interruption, his pen scratching across the pages of his notepad, his expression unchanging. When she was done, she presented the scorched, water-stained pages she had guarded with her life. Those pages became a key, unlocking a floodgate of suppressed pain and injustice. Armed with the names from the ledger, Marshal Vance began to interview the other victims. One by one, they came forward, at first hesitant, then with a growing, righteous anger. Mr. Jensen, the rancher, spoke of the single bad winter that had cost him the land his father had homesteaded. The Miller family, their face etched with grief, told of the medicine they couldn't afford and the blacksmith shop they had lost. The widow O'Connell recounted the mysterious fire that had preceded her own ruin. The names from the ledger became faces, their stories weaving together into a single, damning tapestry of greed and cruelty. Abigail's private horror had become the town's public reckoning. Henry, true to his nature, had vanished back into the silence of his ranch. He wanted no part of the town's gratitude or curiosity, but the world, having been reminded of his existence, would not leave him be. A few days after the arrests, Mr. Jensen had ridden out to his property, a freshly baked apple pie tied to his saddle. Henry met him at the fence line, his face as unreadable as ever. Jensen, a man not given to speeches, simply held out the pie. "For my kids," he'd said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave them their home back." Henry had taken the pie with a curt nod, and Jensen had tipped his hat and ridden away, understanding that was all the thanks the old man could tolerate. Others followed, leaving small tokens at his gate: a mended bridle, a bag of fresh vegetables, a bottle of whiskey. Henry accepted them all with the same stoic silence. A man deeply uncomfortable with the title of hero. He was not a hero. He was just a man who had finally paid an old debt. 2 weeks after the storm, Marshal Vance sent word for Abigail. She met him in his office. The late afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. On his desk lay a single, crisp sheet of paper. "The courts in Prescott have reviewed the evidence," Vance said, his voice formal but not unkind. "The original deed transfer for your father's mercantile, signed under duress and based on fraudulent debt, has been officially nullified. The property, free and clear, is legally yours. Miss McCrae." He slid the new deed across the desk. Her name was written on it in fine, clear ink: Abigail McCrae, proprietor. She picked it up. The paper was heavy, official. It felt like the weight of her entire life in her hands. It was the sum of her father's dreams, the scene of her own deepest trauma, and now, the blank page of her future. She traced her name with her fingertip. It was the first time she had truly felt like she owned it again. "Thank you, Marshal," she whispered, her throat tight. That evening, for the first time, she walked to the mercantile. It had been boarded up by the marshal's office, a crime scene preserved in dust and shadow. He had given her the key. The lock was stiff, but it turned with a loud groan. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with the smell of dust, old wood, and the faint, ghostly scent of her father's pipe tobacco. The place was just as she had left it in her frantic escape. The chair in the corner was overturned. A barrel of crackers had been kicked over. Its contents spilled across the floorboards. The counter was scarred where one of Thorne's men had slammed down the scattergun. It was a place of ghosts, a room saturated with violence and loss. She walked through the main room, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She ran her hand along the scarred countertop, remembering her father standing behind it, measuring out flour or weighing coffee beans. A kind word for every customer. She moved into the back room, the storeroom. Her breath caught in her chest. This was the place of the settlement. The shadows here seemed deeper, colder. She could almost hear their mocking laughter, feel the phantom ache of their fists. A wave of nausea and fear washed over her, and for a moment, she thought she was going to be sick. She leaned against a stack of crates, closing her eyes, forcing herself to breathe. She would not let them have this room. She would not let them own her past. This was her store, her home. She opened her eyes, a new resolve hardening within her. She would clean this place. She would scrub the floors until her hands were raw. She would sand down the scars on the counter. She would paint the walls. She would banish the ghosts with sunlight and hard work. A shadow fell across the open doorway. She looked up, her heart leaping into her throat, a reflexive jolt of fear. But it was not a threat that stood there. It was Henry. He was dressed in clean clothes, his hair slicked back with water. He looked out of place, a piece of the wilderness transplanted into the tamed confines of the town. He held a canvas sack of supplies in one hand. He had clearly come to town for provisions and had seen the open door. He said nothing, simply stood in the doorway, his gray eyes taking in the scene, the overturned furniture, the spilled goods, the determined, tear-streaked face of the young woman standing in the middle of the wreckage. He had seen battlefields that looked less desolate. He stepped inside, letting the sack of supplies drop to the floor with a soft thud. He walked around the room, his gaze missing nothing. He stopped at the scarred counter, running his own calloused fingers over the deep gouges in the wood. Finally, he turned to her. His face was, as always, a mask of stoicism, but his eyes held a deep, quiet understanding. "You can rebuild it," he said, his voice a low rumble. "What your father left you." It was a statement of faith, a benediction. He was telling her she had won, that she had the strength to reclaim her legacy, to put the pieces of her father's life back together. And a month ago, a week ago, even that morning, that would have been the only thing she wanted to hear. But standing here, in this room that held both the best and worst memories of her life, something had changed. The pages from the ledger were burned into her memory. The names, the Jensen Ranch, the Miller's Shop, the widow O'Connell. Her pain was not unique. It was a single thread in a tapestry of suffering that the thorns had woven. Simply rebuilding her father's store felt insufficient. It felt like an ending, when what she needed was a beginning. She looked at Henry, at this man who had saved her, this man who understood the nature of deep, unhealed wounds. "I'm not just going to rebuild what he left, Henry," she said, her voice quiet but filled with a new, unshakable conviction. "I'm going to build something more." He looked at her, his brow furrowed slightly in a silent question. "This place, the Mercantile, it was my father's dream," she continued, a new energy infusing her words. "But my dream, it has to be different now. I think of all those names in that book. I think of the widow O'Connell, who had nowhere to go. I think of what might have happened to me if I hadn't found your ranch. Where do people go when the world takes everything from them?" She gestured around the room, no longer seeing just a store, but seeing potential. "The Mercantile will stay. People need supplies. But the storeroom, the rooms upstairs where my father and I lived, they're empty now. I'm going to clean them. I'm going to fix them up. And if a woman comes to town with nothing but the clothes on her back and fear in her eyes, there will be a room for her here. If a family loses their farm and needs a place to stay until they can get back on their feet, there will be a place for them here." She looked at him, her eyes shining with a purpose that was brighter than any fire. The need for vengeance had been scoured from her, replaced by a fierce, protective need to heal. "I'm not going to build a monument to what I lost," she said. "I'm going to build a place where people like me can start over." Henry stood in the dusty, ghost-filled room and listened. He looked at this young woman, who had been beaten, hunted, and nearly broken, and he saw that she had not just survived. She had been transformed. She had taken the ugliest parts of her life and was forging them into a shield for others. He had spent 30 years hiding from the wounds of his past. She was turning hers into a beacon. He did not smile. He did not offer words of praise. Such things were not his way. Instead, he gave a single, slow nod. It was a nod of understanding, of profound and quiet respect. It was an acknowledgement that her plan was a far better, far stronger thing than simple revenge. In the quiet of the ruined store, with the promise of a new day streaming through the open door, the two survivors stood in silent agreement. The sky was clear now, and it was time to build. Autumn arrived in the high desert not as a gentle fading, but as a sudden, clarifying event. The brutal heat of summer broke one night, and the next morning, the air was sharp and clean, carrying the crisp, resinous scent of pine from the distant mountains. The sky, which had been a hazy, sun-bleached canvas, deepened to a startling, brilliant blue. It was a season of change. And in Red Hollow, the change was more than just the weather. The physical scars were the first to heal. A crew of men, organized by the newly elected town council, had dismantled the blackened skeleton of the bank, carting away the charred timbers and leaving an empty, tooth-gapped space on the main street. The emptiness was not a wound, but a promise, a place where something new could be built. All over town, there was the sound of hammers ringing against fresh nails, the rhythmic rasp of saws cutting through new lumber. The Jensen family, their ranch officially theirs again. were putting a new roof on their barn. The miller's blacksmith shop was open for business, the cheerful clang of the anvil a steady, reassuring heartbeat in the center of town. Red Hollow was not just rebuilding its structures, it was rebuilding its spirit. At the heart of this quiet renaissance was the McCrae Mercantile. From the outside, it looked much as it had under Abigail's father, but cleaner, with a new coat of whitewash on the clapboard and glass in the windows that sparkled in the autumn sun. But inside, the change was profound. Abigail had worked with a tireless, focused energy, scrubbing away not just the dirt, but the memories of violence. The scarred countertop had been sanded down and oiled until the gouges were faint, pale lines, a testament to the past but no longer its defining feature. The shelves were stocked, not with the overpriced goods Sterling had forced on the town, but with fairly priced essentials brought in by wagon from Prescott. But the real transformation had taken place upstairs. The small apartment where she and her father had lived was now 2 clean, simple rooms, each with a sturdy bed, a washstand, and a handmade quilt on the mattress. The first guest had already come and gone, a young woman whose husband had perished in a mining accident, leaving her with 2 small children and nothing but debt. She had stayed for a month, rent-free, helping Abigail in the store, until a cousin could send for her from California. The storeroom, the place of Abigail's deepest trauma, had been converted into a kitchen and a common room, a warm, welcoming space with a cast-iron stove and a long wooden table where people could share a meal. Her pain had been consecrated, turned from a site of violation into a sanctuary. She had done exactly what she'd said she would do. She had built a place to start over. Abigail herself had been remade. The haunted, hunted look in her eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. She was still slender, still young, but she moved with the grounded assurance of a woman who knew her own worth and her own purpose. The townspeople no longer looked at her with pity. They came to her with respect. She was the one who would extend credit when no one else would, the one who listened to their troubles without judgment, the one who had faced down the devil and won. They did not know the full story of the fire and the storm, but they knew that this young woman, with the help of the silent old man from the hills, had given them their town back. Henry Callahan still kept to his ranch. The world, in his estimation, had not changed so much that he wished to rejoin it fully, but the nature of his solitude had shifted. It was no longer a self-imposed exile, a penance for a past failure. It was now a choice, a preference for the quiet company of the wind and the sun. The ghosts of his past were not gone, but they were quieter now, their accusatory whispers replaced by a kind of peaceful, resigned silence. He had faced a moment of truth and had not been found wanting. The debt he owed his sister's memory had been paid, not by erasing the past, but by helping to build a future for someone else. He came into town more often now, once a week for supplies and mail. He no longer felt like a phantom, skirting the edges of a world to which he didn't belong. The townsfolk would nod to him, a gesture of deep, unspoken respect. Mr. Callahan, they would say, and he would give them a curt nod in return. They knew better than to try and thank him with words. They thanked him instead by being good neighbors, by rebuilding their lives with the same quiet dignity with which he lived his own. They understood that he was not a man who trafficked in sentiment, but in action. His actions had spoken for him, once and for all. On a crisp Tuesday afternoon in late October, Henry rode his horse, Soldier, into town. He tied the reins to the hitching post outside the Mercantile and, instead of going straight in for his supplies, he paused. Abigail was standing on the porch, a broom held loosely in her hands. She wasn't sweeping. She was watching Mr. Jensen and his eldest son as they hoisted the final truss into place on their new barn roof, their distant, triumphant shouts carrying on the clear autumn air. A faint, peaceful smile touched her lips. She saw Henry and her smile widened. She set the broom against the wall, went inside, and returned a moment later with 2 tin cups of steaming coffee. She handed one to him. He took it without a word and lowered himself to sit on the top step of the porch, the position feeling as natural and familiar as his own worn saddle. He leaned his back against the support post, the rifle he always carried propped beside him, and sipped the hot, black coffee. Abigail didn't sit. She stood on the porch, leaning against the railing, looking out at the street. The silence between them was not empty. It was a comfortable, living thing, filled with everything they had endured together, everything they understood about each other without the need for clumsy words. They were two pillars of a bridge that had been built across a chasm of violence and fear. They watched the life of the town unfold before them. The Miller boy, fully recovered and strong again, carried a red-hot piece of iron from the forge to the anvil, his father's instructions following him in a companionable shout. The widow O'Connell directed two men as they hung a newly painted sign above her boarding house. Children, released from the small schoolhouse, ran down the street, their laughter a sound that had been scarce and timid only a few months before. It was a portrait of ordinary life, and it was the most beautiful thing either of them had ever seen. This was the true victory. Not the arrests, not the trials in Prescott, not the downfall of the Thorns. The true victory was this: the sound of a hammer, the laughter of a child, the quiet, determined industry of a people reclaiming their lives. Henry looked at Abigail, at the confident way she stood, the quiet strength in her posture. He thought of the terrified, broken girl who had collapsed at his fence line, and he thought of his sister, Sarah, and the life she had never had the chance to live. There was no changing his own past, no soothing that old, deep ache. But in helping Abigail, he had ensured that another young woman's story would not end in tragedy. It was not redemption. It was something quieter, and perhaps more profound. It was a choice, made in a storm, that had allowed this peaceful autumn day to exist. Abigail looked over at Henry, sitting on her steps as if he belonged there. He was her rescuer, her partner, her friend. Their bond was the strongest she had ever known, forged not in romance or affection, but in the crucible of a shared, desperate fight for what was right. It was a bond of absolute, unquestioning trust. She knew, with a certainty that was as solid as the mountains on the horizon, that if she ever needed him, he would be there, and he knew the same of her. It was a love story, of a kind, not the kind written about in novels, but the kind lived out in the hard, unforgiving light of the real world. A love for justice, a love for decency, a love for the simple, profound idea that people deserved a chance to live without fear. The story did not need to end with a wedding, or a ride into the sunset. It ended here, on a quiet Tuesday in October, on the porch of a store that had become a sanctuary. It ended with the understanding that the most important choices are often made in silence. It was about the choice to not be a bystander when the wolves came. It was about the choice to stand up, not just for oneself, but for the idea that a community, a life, a future, was something worth fighting for. It was about the quiet, unyielding belief that even after the most violent storm, the sky can clear again, and in that clear, clean light, it is possible to build. Thank you for listening to our story. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We'd love to connect with you and hear your thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like this video, and support us further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.